Kia ora tātou, me tīmata tātou, tātou nei hui te ata nei, a hau e tū ki te tuku atu he mihi te tuatahi, e tika ana, i te tuarua, ka tuku atu ngā reo haka moimiti ki te atua, kia noi tātou. Let us pray, kia tau, kia tātou ko te rangi Māori, kia mau ki tō tātou nei whare, ko te rongo o te ai o te rangi, te ai o te whenua, nau mai, tomo mai ki te manua. Ko te manaakitanga o te rangi puritea, kia whakaaio i te hirikāpo, kia whakatau i te puku, kia Māori e te rangi, Māori e te pō, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. Kia ora, everybody. I just asked Maybrit if I could open our session this morning. Lovely to see everybody back. Hopefully there's not many blurry eyes this morning after last night, but good to see you all here again after such a great, successful day yesterday. I might pass it back to Maybrit to put a bit of context around this panel session, perhaps. Okay. Kia ora, everybody.
Kia ora koutou, everybody. Welcome back. Just welcome back, really, to this second day of the symposium, and very privileged and honoured and pleased to welcome Derek Kawiti back, and also Amanda Yates and Albert Refiti, and I'm sure that they will introduce themselves much more beautifully. And chairing this session is Elisapeta Heta, who's come down from Auckland from JASMAC. So Elisapeta, can I hand over to you to introduce the panel and the people?
Did you want to talk a little bit about the actual session, the way you set it up, or did you like?
I'm very happy for you to summarise that if you would like to. Great. Okay, so cool. Handing over to you. Thanks, Lynn.
I'm also conscious that yesterday we had sound issues. I can project. I hope you follow all the projecting using your outside voices. Yeah, okay. Well, do we want to give everybody? Oh, okay, we've got it right. There we go. I was going to say, bring it to me forward.
I didn't want people to yell. Oh my goodness. Karaoke time. All right. Ata Māori e koutou. Ai, nei rā te mihi kia koutou katoa I tēnei ata. Mi hatu kia koe, Derek, for your mihi and our karakia this morning. Mi hatu ki ngā kaimahi o tēnei kaupapa. Yes, it's been a really lovely kind of day and a bit, and also all the lead up conversations to get us to this point. So thank you for everybody that's put in a lot of time and effort into that, your kahui, all the many kaimahi that have made today and yesterday and our popo actually possible. So thank you. Ai, ko Elisapeta hine mo Heta taku ingoa. I te tau tōku māma no Samoa toke lau me Inarangi ahau, I te taho tōku pāpa no Ngāti Wai, Waikato Tainui, me Ngāpuhi ahau. Though I come from kind of all over the Pacific and north of here, in sort of Northland and Waikato, I grew up in Tāmaki Makaurau, very much a West Auckland girl. And studied there, and am now a principal at JASMAC's, the architecture firm. I'm based in Tāmaki, but we have a few offices around Aotearoa. So that's a sort of small description, I suppose, of some of the mahi I do, and I suppose why I'm chairing today. I work between practice and sometimes trying to wrangle Albert and some of the mahi that we're working on, which I'll talk a little bit about at midday today. And I like to dabble and or pretend that I still think and can operate in academia, apparently. So we'll see how this morning goes. But I will pass on to my panelists to my left. Albert, most of you might have heard speak yesterday. So Albert, you introduce yourself however you feel the need, but we might ask Amanda and Derek maybe to introduce yourselves, but also just talk a little bit about some of the key mahi that you're working on at the moment, if possible. Kia ora.
Talofalava Leali whano, Albert Refiti, Okay.
You can, yeah.
Oh, I'm from AUT. I run the Vamoana Research Cluster, working predominantly in the Pacific, Samoa, Hawaii, Tahiti, Tonga, and working also in Aotearoa. I'm of Samoan descendant, raised until I came to Tamaki for high school and university. Thank you.
Nā tātou. Nei rā te mihi atu ki a tātou, no nā te rangiwehi, nā te whakaue, te aitanga māhake, rongo whakāta hoki. Ko Amanda Yates toko ingoa, e rere atu nei nā mihi ki a koutou. Yeah, I'm working also at AUT in the new School of Future Environments, Huri Te Ao. And I led the startup. I was the founding head of the new architecture program there, which is really focused around regenerative practices and Indigenous knowledge, really. So we are very, very strongly about a kaupapa of change, which has been really exciting over the last 3 years. We started in 2020, got off to a great start for about a month, and then COVID hit, and it's been, you know, pretty full on since then, but we have really stuck to that kaupapa of change. I'm also the program leader for a quite large National Science Challenge program that's focused on Māori-centred cities and system change. And with Jerome Partington, who I'm not sure if he's here this morning, co-curate Whakaora, which is also started in 2020, social enterprise aiming to catalyse regenerative change in the building industry. Yeah, so system change and Māori is sort of my focus, has been since the year 2000. The first 20 years were pretty demoralising, didn't feel like there was much change going on at all. And then the last 3 years have actually been really awesome, and it feels like there's change happening all over, and communities of change are really starting to link together to affect a kind of wider shift. So that's been super exciting. Kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora, everybody. My name's Derek Kawiti. I'm a newly appointed professor here at the School of Architecture in Victoria University. Yeah, I head the new Māori environments and Indigenous technologies specialisation in the school. That's been the result of say the last 3 or 4 years of thinking around how we could implement more Māori-centred, more Pacifica-centred and value-centred learning and teaching into the school. Result of that is some new hires, which we're very, very pleased to have coming in to support the role that I have. The likes of Mercia, likes of sorry, I've forgotten a few of the other names, but it's been a while since we interviewed everybody, but thankfully they've taken up the position. I wear 2 hats, essentially. I mean, primarily I'm an academic, but I also run a small practice with my wife. I also am associate director at Peddlethorpe in Auckland, and I lead all their cultural engagement and digital restructuring that the firm is undergoing at the moment. In the school here, I teach high-end digital methods and processes, the likes of generative software, that a lot of the young students are really interested to learn. I specialise in robotics as well, but overall, if I were to summarise my approach to what I do as an academic and a technologist, it's trying to understand this really complicated intersection between technology and Indigenous knowledge and how they can either merge or become hybrided or reversioned or rebooted. And so that's an emergent space, I feel, because a lot of our Māori and Pacifica, I guess, formal syntax have been relegated to two-dimensional formats for quite some time, stamping, casting, and moulding and such like, which has been written about all over the world. And so those forms of suppression are finally being lifted with the advent of software that can actually you're actually able to undertake complex geometry, which we have in our cultural arts and guilds. We can finally allow them to breathe away from sort of surface ornamentational approaches. So it's a very exciting space. And so within the specialization, we're trying to move it through so students come out with actually a degree with a subspecialty of Māori design environments and Indigenous technologies, where they learn pseudo political positions, cultural studies, and also they, in terms of their responsibility as especially non-Māori and Māori and Pacifica, engaging with our taonga tukuiho. And so part of that is really getting under the skin of what mātauranga Māori is. So hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about that today. So kia ora tātou. Also, I'll just say that I'll have the robot running this afternoon if people are interested to see what we're doing down there. We're working with play, beautiful materials, but I'll have that running after lunch.
Cool.
I had heard that the robot was being taught to make fry bread, which is actually what I was here for. But sure, clay. Okay. It's been a really wonderful day kind of hearing, I suppose, about the theory and research that's been going into this particular kaupapa. And part of what I understood kind of today's shift in the symposium was to sort of pull into the, not necessarily just design, but some of the tools, as we're hearing from Amanda, and I suppose the application of some of this thinking into mahi or into working with, say, students or other aspects. So it is, we're kind of coming around to some of the applications or of the thinking that maybe we were discussing yesterday. And I think that that's really interesting. One of the questions or the statements I wrote down from one of our earlier conversations with Maybrit and the team around this particular topic of Indigenous design for adaptation in Oceania was sort of, what can design do, or what is a Māori design environment? What is it we're trying to achieve? How we're trying to make our environments better through the research and the application of that. I don't know if I'm summarizing that very well, but I suppose that the people to my left might expand on that a little bit. I am going to just read a quote that I snipped from Instagram yesterday, just to declare my source, from Toi Ngāpuhi, actually. I really liked the quote that I found, because I was thinking about it in relation to a lot of the conversations that were being had yesterday, and I thought it might be an interesting space to start, maybe for Derek to comment on a little bit in relation to some of what you've just said. So the quote is, "Environment breeds tikanga. Our tupuna arrived on these shores with knowledge of how to exist. Through time and careful observation of the taiao, tikanga was shaped and formed to harmonise with the ebbs and flows of Aotearoa, the land of long abiding light. We exist because of this. We are the land and the land is us." And then I was also thinking about that in relation to your proverb yesterday, so we'll get to that in a second. But I suppose I wanted to think a little bit about that idea that environment breeds tikanga. Obviously, also tikanga can then be used to support our relationship to the environment, and there's a push and pull, I think, and that's what a lot of I was hearing yesterday, is that yes, our tikanga has been formed by the environment, but the environment is shifting at a rate that we have also negatively impacted, but it's changing. So what might that look like in your research, or some of the things you're thinking about yourself, Derek, or maybe even some of your students, that idea that the environment might breed tikanga, or how we then push back or support that?
Can't wait to get hold of the microphone. No, that's a little bit of a tough one. And I think it's a tough one because quite often we're thinking of tikanga or customs or traditions as a pure thing. And quite often we're sort of, especially in today's environment, we're trying to almost forensically piece together and reconstruct our cultural identity from fragments and suppression, ramifications of the colonization process. And so it's a big question. because we're always going to have to look back from our 21st century lens and reach back into the, the 17th century generally. And what I think is really important is to take heed of such writers as Māori Marsden and those whose ideas and philosophies are fairly are fundamental and timeless in a way. But he worked with people from the 17th century. He worked with old people who had that lens and knowledge, and we don't have access to those people who practiced and behaved so naturally and organically with a lot of those tikanga. So we're always going to be trying to reinvent or trying to repurpose or reboot. A lot of what I'm trying to teach here at the moment is a responsibility to reach back and to bring back, say, especially within the realm of architecture, archetypes that have been suppressed or we have amnesia about or have fully forgotten, such as the Hakari stages, Pa, Aurora, the tuna weir, and all these, and Atamira and all these old whare tapere as well, and trying to get a sense of how they are or within our own lens, and then how we can reboot or repurpose them within today's design spheres, out in the community where they become more visible. The wharenui and the marae is a really fascinating one because it managed to escape the gauntlet of colonization. It's really durable, and it's our, it's a really deep, it has a deep archetypical relationship back to the Pacific, back to our roots. Generally, we have a kind of tangi or a whakatauki or a mata from the north that says, kei takahia koe ngā papa paunamu o koutou tupuna, titiro atu ki ngā taumata o te moana, which means when your lands are devastated and taken and destroyed, reach back to your origins, ngā taumata o te moana, which in Ngāti Hene, well, in my whānau, we interpret as look back to your origins or look back to the Pacific. Ngā taumata o te moana. A lot of our other relations have a different interpretation, which is look to the future, but it's totally at odds with other parts of it. And that's a mata that waiata-tangi that my tupuna Te Roki Kawiti put forward, and it's only really becoming relevant today. And sorry to take up so much time, but I'll just finish off by saying, at the heart of it is land and the environment. Right through his tangi, he's actually referring to our relationship to land and some of the concepts that Albert was referring to yesterday. This continuum or this continuous differentiation or the smoothness with the Pacific and the smoothness with environment and our relationships between the non-human and human and land. And I'm trying to regain a sense of that. I probably haven't answered your question, but just.
So I guess I find it in practice myself, and even in the way we're trying to think about evolve, hybridize design solutions for both, you can't call them traditional communities, but our iwi and hapu around the country, as well as urban peoples, that you're often going as far back as you can and then trying to pull that forward. I guess I really appreciate your answer, and I think it leads a little bit to what I was thinking around some of Amanda's mahi. So when I also think about tikanga relative to, say, kawa, is that tikanga is that sort of, well, tika being something that is right or correct, and ngā being kind of the pluralization of that, i.e. thinking about the many right ways to do something or to come to something. We obviously have a relationship to it in a whakapapa way, so we think about going back as far as we can. We come forward into time, its application to our relationship today. And I suppose I think about some of the work actually all of you are doing is you're actually trying to go back as far as is reasonable and bring forward what is relevant to be adaptive, to be thoughtful, to be mindful to today's conditions. So I want to think about a little bit that relationship, I guess, to what I would describe as new kinds of tikanga or protocols or customs in relation to the tools you're creating. Amanda, So I would think about that as an adaptation of an old way of thinking to try and bring it forward into the problems of today that we've largely created as a people. I mean, as in human people, not Māori, but yeah, so I guess, do you want to think about that a little bit, the environment and its relationship to tikanga, I suppose, specifically in relation to maybe how you're trying to evolve a tool or think about something as old as Māori, which comes from the Pacific and, exists here in Aotearoa as a term, as an idea. How are you bringing forward this very, it's a term I would say is very charged, the idea of Māori. How are you bringing that forward today to be something that's applicable to Aotearoa, to our design environment and the challenges we currently have?
Kia ora, thanks. Complicated question. Yeah. I guess, well, it's complicated. Yeah. There is a sort of foundational base, I think, to my research, which is it's a papa, it's seeking a foundation which comes from the past. Yeah. But which is always present with us, which is that we are inherently always interconnected and interacting with the living world. We actually can't get away from it. Every time that we breathe in, we're becoming one with the living world. And every time we breathe out, the living world is becoming us. And so when we've been socialised in a sort of Western nature culture split kind of mode, we understand ourselves to be separate. It's actually functionally impossible on a living planet to be separate from the world. We eat a carrot and we become that carrot, So I think that's really the great challenge at this time is for all of us Māori and non-Māori to really return back to earlier sensibilities and earlier knowledges. And to just get rid of that Enlightenment thinking, of the nature culture split thinking, which is conceptually and physically impossible. So that's what my research is really about, is how do we draw through Māori-centred thinking, how do we draw through living systems wellbeing approaches into the built environment. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. What we've been focusing on is just trying to tip the balance in terms of system change. And, what we are needing to do now, and we know very well that the planet has been systematically degraded by a very extractive industrial culture. We know that we can't continue with that. We've reached many planetary boundaries, many limits. So we can't do business as usual now. We do have to shift to a more regenerative, ecological, and I think in Aotearoa, a sort of Māori-centred cultural systems. So that's massive system change. And
do you have an example of one climate change that you
Yeah. So, I mean, the three E's, the three big E's, we need to shift from ecological degeneration to ecological regeneration. So we need to think of our cities as always already ecological. They are always part of the living planet, So there's that a kind of shift to ecological regeneration, working with, nature-based systems, working with ecological systems, working with the more than human, making cities for the more than human, not just for ourselves, not as a kind of poetic, but really as a very pragmatic response and a resilience response, but also as an ethical act, because, the more than human are our whanaunga, we are teina. We need to be much more respectful in the way that we engage with the living world, and our built environments need to really respect and give care to the more than human. Yeah, so that's a shift, obviously. Energy is obviously a shift, needing to decarbonise, move from a carbon-based sort of energy system to renewable, non-carbon energy. And also our economy is currently a linear make waste economy, crazy, dig it out, make something crappy, it breaks within 2 minutes, put it in the dump, you know. We need to move from that. It's not sustainable to a more circular bio-based economy. So those are massive changes in the way we engage with our ecosystems, changes in the way we do our energy systems, changes in the way we do our whole economic and sort of production base of our culture. And it sounds sort of impossible to shift all of those systems at once, while also shifting our architectural and urban environments. But we know that change happens. We know that this is not a universal or normative way to live. Our human culture is always shifting. Our urban cultures are always shifting. Change just happens. And I guess I'm really interested in how that change lands. The research shows that if you've got examples, that's really much more easy to tip the balance. So pilots and case studies are really useful. System change tools can help. So tools that just make it easier for people to understand the change that needs to happen and then activate the change, working co-creatively with communities is a really fantastic way to make change. And we've been exploring that in our National Science Challenge work, working, for example, with Te Arawa to do a Ngā Tohu Māori compass for their housing strategy. So really trying to make clear the kind of set of actions that you need to land energy system change, economic system change, land change, and so that your built environments and your architecture are regenerative. So they've got a compass now which helps them to talk to their developers about what change they want to make. And we have then done a co-creative workshop also with Te Arawa and Rotorua Council to do a first go at an urban compass. Yeah, so it's really just trying to, it's quite a lot to think about, isn't it? Making sort of massive culture change. The compass is really just trying to help tip the balance in terms of this is the change we need to make. Yeah. And through co-creating it, you get people involved in the idea of making that change. Yeah.
You could probably hear my brain whirring, trying to think about, I'm thinking about like 5 different questions I want to ask at the moment and how to link it to Albert's mahi. And I suppose the jump here between Albert looks like he's having a panic attack. No, the jump between I suppose the practicality and also the scale of what you're dealing with, Amanda, and the tools and the use or application of them to the built environment is quite a different shift to you, I suppose, Albert, in that you're thinking about, or you're actually my simple person's understanding of some of the mahi you're doing is kind of going back to those tufunga systems, those, the ways of doing things in the Pacific and what insights that might give you to ideas of resilience or resilience is actually the word I want to focus on, resilience or the re-indigenization of our built environment. This is a funny sideways step, but I suppose you knew I wanted to talk to you about this a little bit. It relates to the idea of tikanga or proverbs as well, things that give us guidance, I think. We often look to our proverbs as a means of giving us steer. They are poetic and metaphoric, but they're often also quite grounding. You spoke of a particular proverb yesterday, but you also then chose to restructure that proverb to suit, I suppose, your current thinking. So as a terrible Samoan who can't speak Samoan, I wrote down the English translation of what you were saying, which you said out loud yesterday: resilience can be achieved if we change our footholds, which I thought was really interesting in relation to this particular conversation about resilience in relation to the Pacific, in relation to climate change and the environment in general. What do you think that proverb means for you? What are you talking about in relation to footholds? What did you think that far ahead? I guess what I'm asking, Albert, because I know you're thinking right now, is what are some examples for you in your research that you're finding or you're discovering at the moment that might be used to help re-indigenize the built environment or to help think about resilience in relation to our communities in the Pacific? Are you finding clues in that?
Go back a bit. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit because these guys talk about some really interesting stuff, and maybe I'll get to that. Whew. Okay, I think it's clear that we are all, three of us and you, and there are quite a few people in the room, Lamas over there, and the minister's probably doing the same thing. So we're trying to, like, indigenizing knowledge and the frameworks from which we arrive at our customs and our identity. And it's anyway, the current research that I'm doing, and Amanda and I guess Derek is doing, is then how do those, the re-indigenizing or rethinking, recovery, rehabilitation of that knowledge, how can we work with that in a meaningful way? And I really like the idea of what we're doing is that indigenizing knowledge, because from a Samoan perspective, Maori perspective, I know a lot of other Pacific Island scholars that I work with, then we can start to exchange so rather than routing our discussions, our discourse through the master's discourse, which is English and translation into English, then I can start talking about, you're talking about Māori, I can talk about Maoli, which is a cognate and similar kind of thing. You know, for Samoan, the only time you hear Maoli, which is cognate with Māori, comes up when we are frightened, or singi lau Maoli, and it comes from the idea that Maoli should always settle in you. It should not show itself, and only show itself when you are startled. So therefore, it's an instinctive thing that comes through our kind of primordial, I don't know, genetic kind of disposition to regulate one's self relative to an environment. So if there is, for Samoans, if there is a notion of Maoli, there is a lot of trouble because a lot of Maoli has been stirred up. And obviously, if we're talking about Māori as a way to rehabilitate the environment, then we realize that the environment, our relationship, we are as a person, is in trouble. So it's one way that I could say the way to trans-indigenize the kind of the languages and the discourse is rather than routing it through, you know, some meaning in science or in a European context, I can kind of talk sideways. So this is the type of thinking that I'm kind of grappling with. And when it comes to the proverb, the Samoan proverb, I know Lama's here, he will tell you his interpretation. And being Samoans, we all have our own interpretation because the Samoan fish is cut up in so many ways, and you can have your piece. E tū mau whaawai, usually translated foundations are, e sui whainga. The way we practice, the way we engage in our work in the world can take on many appearances, many ways of doing. But foundations remain. So what I was trying to say is that with the logics of how we should, from Indigenous perspective, in fact, the environment or this thing called nature is not, it's not just a simple background that our cultures and what we do kind of has to sit against it, or we do everything and the environment or nature just stays still. It's we know we're from all the storms and the cyclones and things. It's not. It's a very, very variable thing. So this background is not simple. It's not mute. It's in fact multiple. And when our ancestors passed away, they merged with this thing. And from my work in architecture and the way landscapes are formed in a meaningful way for us, they look at us. During the day, we rule, we do our work during the day, but at night is when the ancestors come out, when they come back to life, and they hold the environment, and therefore we don't have the depth of field that we have during the day. So so that idea of just changing the idea, don't know the translation. I haven't got my paper in front of me, and I don't have a good memory anymore. Resilience. So the idea of resilience. Resilience for a lot of Pacific communities that live in island as I think as a kid, because I grew up in Samoa in the mid to late 60s and early 70s before coming here, there were always cyclones. There were neighbors were always rebuilding. And so the idea of making place, the idea of making a community was always this active having to engage with cyclones, with droughts, so that the communities, we didn't stabilize the environment so that we can build something for 100 years. It was always pretty on the idea that you have to remake the place all the time. So the notion of resilience is not sort of like build something permanent so that you are secure from this very variable background that's always changing, but that you have to live with it. The Tai Chi thing, you take the force, you internalize it, and you're always moving and changing with that. So that was what I was trying to think about, the notion of foothold, because to Mau in Samoa, it's not as simple to hold your place. You're always engaging with place. And that notion of Mau, when Samoans say Mau, probably similar because it cognates with all the other Polynesian languages, Mau means it's when you stay. It's when you have a constitution, and therefore Albert does not exist, but other things come through Albert. So when you have a whānau, I sit there not as Albert, but I have a title, Leli whānau, and other things come through Albert. So I, as Albert, is the potentiality for those other ancestors, other things to come through me, because I'm no longer Albert, I'm Leli whānau. So that's what Mau means, is to hold a fort for those other layers, those other things in me to be there, to be present. So in a classic case of a whānau and an awa ceremony, you kind of past and present become this really interesting kind of, and I'm sure when you're in Wharenui and other gathering in the Pacific, it allows for the potentiality of other things to come forward. So the notion of tu mau is not necessarily just being able to make things stable and stay the same. No, it's actually allowing for the potential of other things or other ways of doing things to come forward. So it's a lot more interesting and complex than just say the notion of foundation, which we know that it's stable. It's So I don't know if I answered the question. I don't have any particular practice to point to because I think it's I
suppose what this conversation is coming to, other than the fact that I don't think I should have been asked to chair this, partly because I'm sort of like, holy hell, look, there are so many threads to pull on here. But actually what that indicates to me really is the breadth of the discussion and the sheer or the multifaceted nature of what we collectively need to do to be able to approach the issues that we're talking about, right? So we've got multiple methods that are being talked about that are being used to approach this discussion of resilience, the discussion around, our relationship to nature. I guess one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit through the last few days, excuse me while I go on a mild tangent, but we had Professor Robert Juncker in the office a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the relationship to the early writings of wharenui, and that it was always written from the perspective of Pākehā academics, usually standing outside of the house looking at it. Also the prevalence or the introduction of Christianity meant that there were certain things that biased those academics' view of what they were looking at. The idea that the right side of the house was the right relative to standing outside of it and looking at it. And something that I noticed when I was teaching, when I started to teach in the architecture school, was that whenever I would draw the wharenui to explain a pōwhiri process, for example, for my students, I always positioned myself inside the house. And I would draw from the inside of the house out, looking out through the veranda to the ātea into the manuhiri coming on. I wondered if that was purely because I have grown up next to the nannies that were always the kaikaranga standing on the maho greeting the visitors. But I actually realised that it was something that we, the perspective that I found most Indigenous people hold is that we exist on the inside of the conversation, not on the outside of it, looking at it. So I think that's one thing that I found really interesting, I suppose, and maybe a difference in, or actually, sorry, a commonality that I'm hearing from all three of you is this discussion around using the tools that you have at your disposal and in your minds to centre an Indigenous way of thinking and looking out at the field around you. I suppose that's sort of me trying to draw together the three parts of what you're talking about, because you're coming at them all from really different perspectives. But I suppose maybe the universal Indigenous thing here is that we are often inside of the house looking out. And even the concept of nature, and just to talk about nature, concerns me often because we talk about it as if it's something other than ourselves. So for you, Albert, to say, that our ancestors, our tupuna, when they pass away, they literally merge with our environment, that it is not a mute background, says to me that is largely because we are of it. We go back to it. There's a system and a cycle and an ecology. I wondered, Derek, just while you're pondering on the end there, because I like to just be mean, I suppose, but I am trying not to ask such hard questions. But I wonder, just in relation to what these two have said, I'd love to hear your perspective around the application of technology to some of these conversations, I guess. I know that's a bit of a woolly or maybe a long-winded thing, but I suppose sometimes some people might conceive of the digital mahi you're doing as being maybe at odds with the tikanga or the conversations about carbon. I know that they're not at odds, but I'd love to know your perspective on how you think technology and its application might start to break open this conversation. How are you positioning yourself in that?
While I'm a active tool user, meaning I'm on the tools on an everyday basis, either software and hardware and some really high-end tools, by the way. There are some things that can't be made or conceived of via those tools, as well as regardless of how sophisticated they are. Well, no, we're having a go at that, getting a robot to make fry bread. But and I've been in a position where, with Māori Arts and Crafts Institute, where we went around with a robotic point of view, and we realised that 70% of the things that were there we couldn't reproduce or duplicate with any type of tooling, that only hands could make that. And so being really interested in the implications of technology and in terms of our kawa and tikanga, in terms of through the adoption of high-end technology, what is lost, what is lost and what is gained. What do we give away as Indigenous people to these machines and to these tools? And so I don't really have the answer to your question, because I think it's a really complicated question that like I said yesterday, we're still in catch-up mode with our mātauranga. And even mātauranga Māori as a term was only invented in the late 1980s through a whole lot of different forces, and then there are different there's mātauranga iwi, that's Ben Doherty, Ngai Tūhoe, I think it's Chaz's brother, and others, and so our concept of mātauranga Māori needs to be unraveled as well. And so I often declare I'm totally not an expert at mātauranga Māori at all, and mainly because of the tools that I use. But I am interested in the effects that some of these tools produce and how they might align with reconceptualizing what our mātauranga is, in terms of even emulating the way things are made through bolting on different accessories onto robots at a low and high tech kind of approach as well. There was a group in existence, a robotics group, who had Indigenous Canadians, First Nations Canadians in the early 2000s, and they were putting some of their old stone tools onto robots, and using robots, reconceptualizing the robot in order to make it relevant for the day and age. New Zealand Māori Arts and Crafts, NZ Maki, who have been, they've had the mandate to preserve and reproduce and replicate the Māori arts for some, 70 odd years. And they said if tupuna, if ancestors had brought, or if Captain Cook had an ABB robot on the Endeavour, they would have, thrown everything else aside and grabbed the robot, which shows how, how in terms of not so much resilience, but in terms of adaptive conceptualization of technology, and the idea that technology is not necessarily deterministic, is a really valuable trait, I think, that a lot of our Pacific people have. It's just a matter of having the right technology in the right hands, I think. So a lot of what I do is to try and feel out that space, not try and fully close down the space of exploration, but to try and open it up. But there are limits to it. Like a young woman last night talking about, where is the line with people with provenancing and acknowledging and bringing about Pacific and Māori notions of collectivity and provenancing of work and those sorts of things. So being really careful around understanding where the line and the limit is. Ki te kore he tikanga he kore. So if you don't have tikanga, you really don't have anything. If you don't have customs and traditions and no limits, you kind of end up with a lot of things that we have today, where things are picked up and dropped and adopted, and truth is questioned and questioned. And we're in a little bit of a what would you call it? A phenomenological crisis. Or an epistemological crisis. And so technologies in the application to some of the ideas that Albert and Amanda are referring to is absolutely, that you will find a technology that will either not so much replace it, but might enhance it or collate it or aggregate it. And, the elephant in the room is, AI. And how you might interpret AI through an Indigenous lens, and that is essentially through setting up biases, which is totally what AI is not, claims not to be, setting up biases and positions within the tool or a tikanga or a kawa built into those tools. And you can ask, ChatGPT-4, can you create a Māori supermind with, or can AI evolve into a Māori supermind through the adoption of biases? And it will tell you, yes, it can do that in these certain conditions. So it provides these really, and it sounds really banal, and it kind of is, but because now there are endless boundaries, the boundaries have been extended and pushed out, but it only really acts on the data and information that is out there. So there are some fatal flaws to it as well. But and I know Māori are working with these tools at the moment. There are a lot of data, people actively engaging with AI from a Māori epistemological point of view, Māori beliefs and values framework point of view. So expect some really interesting results or not, I think, because it's all out there and up for grabs. I'll probably never answer this question, but I did pick up on some of your terminology and Albert's terminology as well around re-indigenization and not decolonization, or this idea of renaturing. And it's kind of, for me, just to finish off, it's an interesting point, this re-indigenization, because I would say it's around about 30 years old in Aotearoa. It's a very, very slow process and I think, Albert, when we're both at Noel Lanes, there was a bit of that starting to kick off, where motifs and symbolism and iconography was starting to be adopted and stamped onto facades and that sort of thing. So a whole industry sprung up around that in terms of how you deliver that. And we still have, that's still, it's developed into what we have today with all these new sophisticated facades. But I guess from my point of view, the problem I have with that sort of work is that while it signals a new shop front for re-indigenization or renaturing, I think it's also a form of technological suppression in terms of not really unlocking the performative aspects of materials, performative aspects of pattern organization, which is latent, which is overlooked because of this surface applique. And so I think that's a real problem. And I think that the current state of embellishing facades and adopting patterns and using industry formats and materials is very, very limited in terms of freeing up the geometry, the mathematics, and those performative aspects that only through having access to computers that we can actually finally understand and do, but we're sort of choosing to continually suppress these things in the built environment. So while we have this strong push in re-indigenizing visually, we're not actually looking at your initial question, which is the environment is tikanga. The environment tells us how to act and behave through the way it performs, basically, and the way that we are in it, and its interior and its exterior, with its forces, its atua. Those sorts of things are continually oppressed through a material approach that is part of the current applique to cultural expression, which I think is unacceptable. The other option is, the elephant in the room, I guess, is decolonization. So I'm going to pass on that one, or renaturization, which is what this is. It's starting to morph into that re-indigenization to renaturization.
Well, I guess just to say, in terms of the surface applique, it can be quite comforting. You can think, we're landing, some sort of Indigenous presence there, but really, as you suggest, it's thin. It's very thin, and what's much more powerful and much more important, I think, is landing the ontological shift. Landing the shift in the way we understand ourselves to be in the world, and to be with the world, and to be as the world. And so if we do that, then we don't just put some pretty patterns on the building. We make the building be respectful. Gather and slow water. We make the building generate energy. We make it generate food. We make it green or blue so that it makes the people in it better. And we get all of these kind of co-benefits. We get a sort of vital, thriving, well-being we get Māori through that ontological shift of wanting to bring wellness and thrivingness to the whole living system. And it's a lot more than just a pattern. Yeah. So it drives me crazy when, you whack a koru on something and like, done. It's profound. The shift that needs to happen is really profound and very meaningful. If we can land it, even partially, it will be utterly transformative. Yeah. So I think that's the work that we're all in various ways probably exploring. Yeah, which is great.
There you go. Yeah. It's a hard one, Derek. For me, at least from Samoan, or now trying to do the Indigenous thing, where kind of address artificial intelligence, at the core of the problem from say the stuff that I know about being Samoan is that the intentionality, which is human, is given over. We don't know. And that's for Samoan people and for most Indigenous people, that's not something new. In fact, we have prayer because we have no idea. And so the notion of a chant and a prayer, we give over our intentionality to something other than ourselves, other than the human. And therefore, there is a logic there that you can think that if the robotics or the things that will automatically work in its own capacity rather than have our control already works with that idea of what I had mentioned, that the variable background that we live, which is the environment, have that idea that we can't control it. We as humans, we create things to hold back that other thing there. And I think what's really interesting with the development of artificial intelligence, let alone the intelligence that drive things that are free from us, is that they will now merge into that background, and it becomes a really, well, it's already, one way to say it, it's already kind of indigenous. The artificial intelligence is already indigenous, because every time we do a virtual call on Zoom, we're in that space. We go to pray, we go to engage with this other world. We chant into that kind of, God knows. So in terms of a logic, it already is indigenous. It already enters into that world of no longer have the control as a human, as a species of things, but we are now countering how knowledge can actually start now to engage with those other things running around freely in either. So that's one way to kind of think through the, architecture is a weird thing, because the reason why a lot of us started to put motifs on things is because we wanted to name things. Especially for Indigenous architects, when buildings do not reflect who we are, and they have Palangi names, they have Palangi intention, they're stripped of ornamentation. Most of us in architecture know why the capacity for stripping ornamentation was a particular logic in modernity. So there was a period there for a lot of us in architecture, we wanted to name it so that there's a name on it, because we know that when you're in at least in Samoan context, when you name something, it's really important. I carry an ancestral name, and that name has remained for over 500 years. And we know that when you're the notion of the symbol, which had a bad rap under my education and deconstructivism, I think it's really important. The notion of the symbolic value of things have to return, especially for Indigenous people, because we do have the legacies of remaking worlds when we moved across the Pacific by carrying our symbols and our whakapapa, which we overlaid onto different environments as we moved. That's why we have the same names from Hawaii to here in Aotearoa, because we carried those symbolic values, those stories with us, and we laid them onto the landscape, which is how we had done those obviously as in a kind of customary way. So, yeah.
The question or the I suppose it's not a binary, but there's been a discussion over the last several years, I suppose, through, well, I'll just say several years in my own practice and discussions and public conversations I've been involved in, where often decolonisation and re-indigenisation are sort of set up as this binary thing. I've sort of come to a position personally where I find that the two have to work hand in hand. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is both a reconnection to old systems we know and or knew, that our people knew, and bringing them forward, as well as getting them to make sense relative to the new world that those old systems now have to exist in. And I suppose there's this intrinsic link between this, you know, we know this, the social structures of a people, the religious structures of that people, their understanding of the environment and their relationship to it, and therefore the architectural structure, literally, physically, symbolically, that then represents that, and it sort of sits in this, and there's other aspects to that as well. I'm being very reductive in my description, but that kind of live in a bit of an ecosystem and they bounce off of one another. One way of thinking about sort of, I suppose, the comment you made, Amanda, which I totally agree with, you know, slap a koru on it and be like, ooh, we're done. There's a big difference, I think, between applying a koru to something and working with a carver to place a piece of carving. Now, I know you weren't making that distinction, but I suppose the difference there, and something that we've been talking about a lot, Albert and I, is sort of the recodifying of our buildings to ensure that they reflect the social, spiritual structures of the people that they've come from, but also to reflect the environmental and climatic relationships of the place that they exist in. And we know that our symbology, our motifs, our carvings, as well as the pragmatic layouts of buildings and spaces and your relationship to them are all intrinsically linked. All of those things relate to one another. But I suppose something that I've been hearing a lot, which we know, and, you know, like Becky was touching on it yesterday, and we've all touched on it today, the severing of our relationship to, or that whakapapa kind of iteration of our pūrākau that Maya was talking about, where we were handed things time and again, generation to generation, the severing of that has meant that we're now in this funny, tipsy place of trying to grab at parts of that ecology to make the whole ecology work. And I suppose again, this is my simplistic view, but I think the application of things like symbols to buildings was an overly simplistic way at trying to grab at something to make the whole thing make sense. That's a very brief way of kind of pulling all of that kōrero together, because I'm coming to the position where I think in my own practice, and hell, you might all disagree with me, and in 20 years' time this might change entirely, but I do think that in that co-creation of space, Indigenous peoples are still wanting to see artistic, symbolic representations of themselves in buildings, because they're also representations of their relationship to the environment, which they are often trying to fight for the health of. So if I think about projects, for example, where we're talking about working with Wanganui, and we're talking about that very well-known whakatauki ko te awa ko au, you know, that is an intrinsic relationship where these people are measuring themselves based on the health of their awa, which is very unhealthy. So in order for a building to even fundamentally acknowledge that whakatauki, it has to be contributing to the health of the environment around it. So it's sort of it's the round and round merry-go-round that we're all engaging with, but I suppose we're all trying to pick up on parts of the puzzle to make the whole puzzle work. And that is a challenge, and inherently why this conversation was probably had lots of bits to it and is complicated to answer. And yes, Amanda wants to say something.
I do. I mean, I too, was going through architecture school in the 80s. And so it is quite triggering for me, the whole purukuru on it, because that was where it was at. And, that was a time where it was newly signalled that climate change was a real problem we were going to have to engage with, but a massive culture shift. And yet, pattern making was seen as enough. And you're done, but you're still putting it onto an extractive industrial culture, colonial building framework. So it's not a thing about the pattern, the symbology, which is so powerful and beautiful. It's that needs to go on to an architectural and an urban framework that's inherently regenerative, ecological, made from materials that go back into the earth and then can come out again. And, so it is exactly that thing of getting a really coherent ecology, that is regenerative. Yeah.
Just quickly add to that. No, not quite. But I don't think we need to make a fuss about it. I mean, I don't think we need to stamp patterns on everything. And I think what Tūhoe are doing, even though Tūhoe have some very iconic buildings as part of their estate, and my mother was Tūhoe as well, from Waimana. And they're focusing on the behavioural side of things. So what that means is that they have courses for their Tūhoe people so if you want to be part of this housing set up, you need to learn how to be a good neighbour. So when we transition you out of your motor car, living in your car, into a house, you need to forget all those bad habits, and you need to focus on different behaviour in order to live in this house. And they do that with all their buildings. And fortunately enough, they have living buildings, and most of the petals are realised, and they have accreditation, everything else. And Jerome would confer with that. And but it's very much a behavioural tikanga practice, because in the north, I mean, we don't embellish our buildings at all, either inside or outside, but they still manage to function with our tikanga. All the behaviour is transferred virtually. You learn it. There are no walls to direct you and cues. It's a very sort of learned way of using space, and it changes dynamically with the different ritual that is engaged at particular times. And so I really believe you don't need to make a fuss about that stuff. I think we need to focus a lot on what, some of the things that Amanda is talking about, that sort of structures your physiomotor behavior. But how do you indigenize that? How do you indigenize behavior in such a way in order to complement your part, much like a wharenui, you're part of that wharenui, but you activate the house at particular times and in spaces. And so how do you draw that into not only your human behavior, but the performative behavior of a building? So I think that's part of the task as well, and not to get so, I really get sort of wound up at seeing a lot of patination on buildings, especially ones that are delivered via technologies from the Industrial Revolution. So it's really because that's part of our addiction as well, through all these materials and processes and factory types of processes that just perpetuate it. But I'll leave that's enough for me, I think.
I'm conscious of time, and we are the first people up this morning, so I don't want to push everything back in the whole day. But I do agree, Derek, and I guess maybe one way that I like to think about it is that it's very clear, and this is what decolonisation, I think, talks about, that there needs to be quite a severe disruption to a system that's not working. And I think that coming at it from pattern making is not enough of a disruption. That's my view of it. I think, though, that when you think about not pattern making, but a relationship to the system of why those particular symbols existed in our houses, which is actually talking more about tikanga and whakapapa, not necessarily the pattern, then you get to conversations about behaviour, which I think is much more interesting personally as well. So we're unpacking a very big topic right now, but it is an interesting one. It's a really fascinating problem we're coming to today, right? You know, so and Albert wants to say something. Albert's going to say one more thing, and then we'll stop talking.
Yes.
It's a good one.
I mean, God. See, the thing about decolonisation is not necessarily about pattern making. I think pattern making is an important aspect of what we do as Indigenous. We have to indigenize language, and we do it badly sometimes. But what I think decolonisation, we've got to agree, it's to do with trauma, and it's to do with, and I think architecture can't do that at the moment. You can't deal with trauma in architecture. Well, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I have no idea. Yes, exactly. You know. And I think that the space for decolonisation, you really need to get the other partner who has caused the harm in the space, which is the colonizer, needs to be part of the discussion. I don't think you can have decolonisation and give the work to all of us who are being traumatized by the whatever it is that caused the harm. I think that the decolonisation, the partner or the person who had caused most of the trauma has to be in the room. I don't think it can be achieved by just us using our pattern, using our knowledge. It will probably won't work because the other guy will start thinking, oh, well, they've got their time, so then nothing will always go on. I think the first part of that discussion is reconciliation, admitting the harm or whatever, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And then for the Indigenous part, for us to recover our knowledge, to rethink it, and then we can compare what we have with each other. And then the third one, really looking at what is this thing? How can we make sure that the trauma, the harm, the violence can never happen again? Yeah, I don't think decolonisation is a style or is a thing. I think it's a really important political thing to happen.
It's lovely. Albert told me at breakfast something that's really interesting is we don't really lead with our politics. Kia ora, Albert. But I also think it's impossible in some respects to leave politics at home when you're an Indigenous person. I just don't know that that's possible, but that's cool. That's a really silly throwaway comment from me to end this. Look, thank you all three of you for your kōrero. I hope this was at least interesting. I think what it's doing is continuing to unfold aspects of the discussions from yesterday and probably all sorts of things that we're trying to deal with and understand actually through our own research. I will say myself, I will admit that I feel as though I'm maybe not even doing enough in this space of what resilience might look like until I start to hear these discussions and realize how I'm coming at it or what I'm doing to try and contribute to the discussion. So maybe yesterday I felt like I was arriving as a guilty party somehow, and maybe today I feel less guilty. I don't know. But look, I think more than anything, I do just want to thank again the organisers, because I do think this is a really fascinating and quite wonderful and urgently important conversation to be having. I'm also kind of a last little note or acknowledgement for me is that what I'm really loving seeing a shift in some of these spaces over the last few years, and this is my bias or my view, is this reconnection between Aotearoa and Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori back to our Pacific relationships and that whakapapa extending beyond just Aotearoa. And I say that purely because I think we're continuing to unlock a lot in that discussion, and also just thinking about the greater body of the moana and te moana nui a kiwa. So I'm really loving that there is this interweaving conversation that is happening that is strengthening a position, I think. Personally, you can fight me about that later if you disagree. That's cool. But other than that, just join me in thanking our speaker.